Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, everyone, get ready. We're hitting fast forward on the time machine today.
Fast forward. This sounds intriguing already.
Yeah, we're diving into a period that honestly sometimes gets a little lost in the shuffle, in history classes and stuff. 1943 to 49, but the twist is we're focusing on Asia.
Ah, fascinating. Because we often think about the Cold War as this Europe-centric face-off, right? But you're saying Asia was absolutely crucial during those early years.
Exactly. And thankfully, you sent over a ton of amazing sources on this. So we're going to really dig in and uncover how this specific time and place, Asia in the aftermath of World War II, set the stage for the whole Cold War's Eastern Front.
And what's so captivating about this period is that we're not just talking about two superpowers, squaring off. This is about the birth of a whole new world order, right? Decisions being made in Washington and Moscow, but playing out on the streets of Seoul, in the villages of China.
Yeah.
Heck, even back home in American living rooms.
Yeah, it's like we're about to peel back this hidden layer of the Cold War. Like the version we all learned in school was just the trailer, and now we're getting the whole film.
100%. And it all begins truly in the ashes of World War II.
You're talking about those two words that still carry so much weight. Atomic bombs.
Chilling, right? August 1945, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki.
We know on the surface they brought World War II to a brutal end. But the sources you shared, they suggest something way bigger was going on. Like these weren't just final blows to end one conflict, but...
Opening shots in a brand new one almost.
Exactly. Like the U.S. was sending a message to the Soviets just as much as they were targeting Japan. What do you think?
It's a question historians still debate. The traditional view, what we often call the Orthodox school, they'd say, no way, the bombs were solely about ending the war, ASAP, saving lives on both sides. But then you have revisionist historians, and they see it as this very calculated power move, like, hey, world, look what we've got. Don't even think about testing us.
So less about ending a war, more about establishing who's top dog in this new world order.
Right. And it plays directly into those core tensions of the whole Cold War, Containment, deterrence.
Yeah.
The terrifying idea of mutually assured destruction hanging over everyone's heads.
Okay, so Japan surrenders. Now the U.S. is in this wild position. They get to essentially reshape a nation, and they chose to rebuild it as a democracy. Just imagine the weight of that responsibility.
The occupation of Japan is such a fascinating period because on the surface, you see these really benevolent efforts, right? Rebuilding infrastructure, setting up democratic institutions, all with good intentions, presumably. But some historians argue, and it's hard to ignore, that those actions, however well-intentioned, were also strategic.
Strategic in the sense?
In the sense of containing Soviet influence. They didn't want to just rebuild Japan. They wanted to make sure it didn't become a communist state.
So it's this blend of humanitarian aid and Cold War chess, basically.
Exactly. And this is where grasping those different schools of thought on the Cold War gets super important. You've got that Orthodox view, the U.S. as the hero, right, protecting the free world from the big bad communists. But then you have the revisionist perspective, and they argue that, hold on, the U.S. was just as motivated by self-interest, expanding their own influence, as they were by containing communism.
So depending on whose glasses you're wearing, you get a completely different picture of what the U.S. was up to.
And just to make it even more nuanced, then you have post-revisionist historians, and they come in saying, hey, maybe it's not so black and white. They think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay, so while all this is happening, the U.S. rebuilding Japan, there's this whole other situation brewing on the other side of the continent. Korea. One nation suddenly split in two. A communist north, a U.S.-backed south. Both sides wanting control. Man, that sounds familiar.
Right. It's the classic Cold War scenario. And it escalated fast, from political maneuvering to a full-blown conflict, the Korean War. Historian John Lewis Gaddis, he even calls Korea the first real battle of the Cold War. This is where containment, it stopped being some theoretical policy and became this brutal reality with soldiers on both sides fighting and dying for their side's ideology.
And just like that, this abstract idea of, ideological conflict, it becomes very, very real, very human. It's not just lines on a map anymore.
Exactly. And as tragic as Korea was, it was nothing compared to what was about to unfold in China.
So we've got Korea on the edge of becoming a full-blown war zone. And meanwhile, on the other side of the continent,
things were about to get even wilder. 1949, Mao Zedong, the communists, they secure victory in China. Years of civil war, and they come out on top.
this is huge, right? I mean, talk about a turning point, not just for Asia, but for the whole world. The balance of power shifted dramatically that year.
Absolutely. And for the U.S., talk about a gut punch. I mean, imagine being in those rooms in Washington. Their whole strategy, this idea of containment, it was practically unraveling before their eyes.
Yeah, can you even imagine those headlines? China goes red. It must felt like this seismic shift, this validation of their worst fears.
Because that's the thing, right? The fall of China, it wasn't just a strategic loss for the U.S. It messed with their heads. It made this whole domino theory, this idea that if one country falls to communism, the rest will follow. It made that feel very, very real.
Okay, so you've got this real fear-taking root. And fear can make people do some pretty drastic things.
And it did. This is where the Red Scare, which had been kind of simmering in the background in the U.S., it boils over. Senator McCarthy, he goes full-on witch hunt mode. Communists everywhere, apparently. In the government, in Hollywood, you name it.
So you've got this incredible pressure cooker situation. In Asia, the Cold War is getting hotter by the minute. And back home, America's gripped by suspicion and paranoia.
Which brings us to this super secret document, like ripped from the pages of a spy thriller, NSC 68.
NSC 68, fill us in. What was the deal with this plan?
Okay, so picture this, 1950. The world's still reeling from World War II, and suddenly, bam, China goes communist. So the U.S., they're like, okay, enough is enough. They draft NSC 68, and basically it outlines this whole new, much more aggressive strategy for dealing with the communist threat.
Aggressive, meaning?
Meaning they were ready to throw everything they had at it, more money for the military, alliances all over the globe, and this willingness to jump into a fight anywhere. Communism seemed to be gaining ground.
So it's like they went all in on this global game of Cold War poker. And you have to wonder, would they have gone that far without those events in Asia? Without the Red Scare fueling the fire back home?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
Historian Melvin Loeffler, he argues that NSC 68, it wasn't just a reaction to what the Soviets were doing. He says it was about the U.S. deliberately shaping the narrative. Like they wanted to define the terms of the whole Cold War.
So less about reacting, more about dictating how this whole conflict was going to play out. It's like they were writing the script and everyone else was just along for the ride.
And that's what makes studying this period so fascinating, right? Because depending on which historian you ask, whose interpretation you look at, you get a totally different take on the U.S.'s role in all of this.
Yeah.
The Orthodox view, they'd say the U.S. was completely justified, the Soviets were a real threat, and someone had to stand up to them.
But the revisionists, they'd probably say, hold on a second.
Exactly. They'd say, hold on, the U.S. wasn't just this innocent bystander. They were looking out for their own interests, expanding their influence, and maybe even using the fear of communism to justify some not-so-noble actions.
And then, just when you think you've wrapped your head around it all, you've got the post-revisionists, right? Trying to find that middle ground.
Always keeping things interesting. They'd say, look, it's never that simple. The truth is probably somewhere in between those two extremes.
It's like we're seeing this constant back and forth, this wrestling match between different interpretations of history. Is there ever a clear winner in that kind of debate?
Right. It's amazing how one event, one period, can be seen in so many different ways, and every new perspective adds a whole new layer to the story.
Yeah. And that's the thing about history. It's messy. It's complicated. And the more you learn, the more you realize there's no easy answers, just more questions.
Totally. Okay, so let's do like a quick rewind, our recap of this whole whirlwind tour of Asia from 43 to 49. We started with the U.S. dropping the atomic bombs on Japan, right? And then almost like a 180, they become this architect of democracy, rebuilding the nation from the ground up.
And it's worth remembering the specifics, right?
Yeah.
Like, they didn't just impose some generic system. They brought in land reform. They created a whole new constitution, one that actually empowered women and workers, which was pretty radical for the time. And they poured resources into rebuilding Japan's industry. These actions, regardless of like the motivations behind them, they really did transform Japanese society. Yeah, it's not just some abstract idea. It really happened. And meanwhile, you've got Korea, right? This brand new nation, instantly divided, and it becomes this tragic battleground, this proxy war where the U.S. and the Soviet Union are basically going head to head, but on Korean soil. Can you imagine, like, living in a country that's suddenly been ripped in half, families separated, this constant fear of war hanging over everything?
It's heartbreaking, really. And then, as if that wasn't enough, you have the communists winning in China, which sends shockwaves everywhere. The U.S. is freaking out. Paranoia is running rampant. And boom, you get NSC 68, which, like we talked about, really shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades to come.
It's mind-blowing how much happened in such a short time. The atomic age, the rise of Communism, the Red Scare, Korea. I mean, these events, they didn't just impact Asia, they sent ripples through the entire world. And we're still dealing with those ripple effects today in so many ways.
Yeah. It makes you think about, like, the choices leaders make. Right? The consequences, both the ones they intend and the ones they don't, and how those choices just echo through history, shaping the world we live in, even today.
Totally. It's like we're not just studying history, we're uncovering these hidden connections, these threads that tie the past to the present. So for someone listening who's like, wow, I need to learn more about this, what's the key takeaway? What's the one thing you want them to walk away with after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there's always more to the story.
Mhm.
Like, never accept a simple explanation, especially when it comes to something as complex as the Cold War. Always dig deeper, look for different perspectives, question everything.
So next time you're reading about history, don't just take it at face value. Challenge it. Look for the missing pieces, the voices that aren't being heard. You might be surprised what you discover.
Exactly.
Hmm.
There's always more to uncover.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, everyone. That's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into the events that ignited the Cold War in Asia. Thanks for coming along for the ride, and until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep those history books open.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.